Tank podcast. I'm delighted today to be joined by a couple of friends from Sport England. I'll let them introduce themselves in a couple of seconds. But we're here today really off the back of the latest Active Life survey and obviously the unveiling and probably now the delivery of the Sport England strategy. And who better could we have than Nick Pontefract and Naomi Shearon from Sport England to sort of unpack that. So welcome, both of you. Really great to be here. I would let you introduce yourselves a little bit. Nick and I, we've known each other in both your sort of previous roles in sport, both over at DCMS and of course now at Sport England. And Naomi, we were just saying it doesn't seem that long ago since we were working together on launching the consultation for the strategy, which of course now has gone through a pandemic, the latest iterations of the problems that are thrown at the sports sector in 2023. So we'll try and find out how that's standing up to the latest pressures. So Nick, do you want to just sort of briefly introduce yourself, and then Naomi, and then we'll kick off.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andy. So I am Nick Pontefract. I'm currently the Chief Strategy Officer at Sport England and have been since the start of the year. Before that, I was 4 years as the Chief Operating Officer, which is a one-word distinction, but feels quite important, particularly for some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today. Before that, and I think when we first got to know each other, Andy, I had quite a long time in the civil service. So I did about 15 years in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, working on all sorts of things, looking after ministers on a day-to-day basis, but kind of got into sport around 2014 when I became, I got the best title in the whole of the civil service. I got to be head of sport, which was brilliant fun. In doing that, got to do
tickets, I'm sure.
It was definitely not about the tickets. That was a nice little spin-off benefit. The best part was it gave me the opportunity to write a sports strategy, which was good fun and I hope made a bit of a contribution to the direction that we're all taking. And after that, moved over to Sport England to help put it into practice.
Brilliant, thanks, Nick. And Naomi.
Hi, so I'm strategy lead at Sport England. So I suppose most latterly, I have led the process of developing Sport England's latest strategy, Uniting the Movement, and the subsequent implementation plans about how we're going to actually deliver against the commitments and the vision of that strategy. On a personal level, I came to activity in sport late in my life. I didn't grow up in an environment where there was many opportunities. It wasn't very normal in my family or my community, and it's really transformed my life. You know, I'm fundamentally healthier in every single way because of my relationship with movement and sport, and that means a lot to me. And so that's almost my personal mission, my involvement with Sport England, and I have a real belief in this strategy. Before my work with sport, I was behaviour change strategist, so behavioural research and developing change strategies with a whole host of organisations and sectors. Now single-mindedly focused on this incredible challenge and opportunity of a more active nation.
Oh, fantastic! Thanks, Naomi. And hopefully both of your past experiences sort of brought to this job, which is really important. I suppose, Nick, what triggered particularly the interest in this is that, well, first of all, the congratulations on that sports strategy in 2016. It did shift quite a lot when you look back sort of over the last 20 years of sports strategies. It shifted a whole emphasis onto what we were trying to achieve, and obviously Naomi, the latest strategy sort of takes that on even a stage further. I can't believe you've been there for 4 years, Nick. It only seemed 2 minutes ago since you sort of moved across, so congratulations on that. But I suppose what triggered this conversation was really you presented to us some of the latest Active Life survey post-pandemic, and of course what it highlighted was still these inequalities of being sort of increasingly embedded in the figures. But do you want to, both of you, just sort of highlight what your you've been monitoring these figures for a long time, and sometimes you're not totally surprised, but was there anything else in particular that sort of stood out from these sort of latest figures post-pandemic?
Is it worth me just taking a quick canter through some of the headline findings?
I think so, because I think people read the press release, and if you look at your local area, people might sort of look at sort of the local stuff. But really, those big picture bits, what is the takeaway? And then I suppose, Naomi, it translates then, you know, how does the strategy stand up against that, and where we sort of go from here together? So if you want to just run through those, Dick, for a few minutes, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, of course. So I guess overall, I should say the period of data that we're looking at, the field work was between November of 2020 and November of 2021. So it covers pretty much all the flavours of COVID response and lockdown, from that awful Christmas of 2020 that got cancelled at the last minute. Nobody could do anything, really strict restrictions in that January, right the way through to the kind of July, August period of last year, where actually pretty much all the restrictions were removed and people could broadly do what they want, at least when it came to sport and physical activity. And we've really seen that journey through the figures. It's a properly mixed picture. So in that winter, it was pretty bleak. There was not a great deal that people could get out and do. But after that, we definitely have seen a partial recovery. We're not back to where we were pre-pandemic overall. There's certain subsections of society and certain activities that definitely are, but there's some that are really lagging behind. So the kind of recovery isn't universal. So not everyone's getting to experience it. One of the most troubling parts of it is that the inequalities that we've all been working really hard for a long time now to try and address have if not stayed where they were, they've actually worsened. So we've seen particular demographic groups where we've really focused time and energy and effort actually have gone backwards, and not backwards just in terms of their sports participation rates, but actually all of the outcomes. They've been particularly badly affected, and we need to work disproportionately to try and re-engage them with sport and across the board. We've got there's some good news in there. So team sports in particular, unsurprisingly, because it's more outdoors than in, saw a really strong recovery in the early summer, nearly back to where they started pre-pandemic. Again, unsurprisingly, those sports and activities that are more reliant on indoor activity have struggled and are lagging behind because of that period of restriction where you just couldn't go to the gym, you couldn't go for a swim. So that has seen less of a recovery, and we're still seeing, gyms and fitness attendance levels tracking at sort of 70 to 80% of where they were before the pandemic. There's some other good news when it comes to kind of particular age groups. So the over 55s are back to their pre-pandemic levels, and that's been mainly driven by a continued interest and desire to walk for leisure. So obviously kind of everyone remembers when that was pretty much all you could do, is get out either for a bike ride on your own or go for a walk. That's turned out to be a really sticky habit for people. We're seeing those numbers go up and up and up, and it's an area that is of kind of disproportionate focus for older people. So we're seeing those numbers look really positive. At the other end of the spectrum, though, for younger people, so for children and for younger adults, the picture's not great. We were seeing before the pandemic numbers declining. The pandemic's kind of doubled down on that and made it particularly big problem. So, as an example, 16 to 24-year-olds participation rates are down 8% on where they were pre-pandemic. And even as you get into the kind of 24 to 35 age group, it's still down by 4%. And because we saw that happening before the pandemic hit, we know that's not just about the particular impact of COVID. So there's something bigger and broader, societal, socioeconomic about that age group that means that sport and physical activity, as we're delivering it now, is becoming less relevant. Like, not for everybody. It's not a kind of one-size-fits-all thing, but we're seeing a trend away from those sorts of activities. And I think that's something as a sector we need to really, really reflect on and think about the offer that we provide. I could go on and on for hours on this stuff, as you know, Andy, but the one other one that I just wanted to highlight, because I think it's particularly interesting, is the impact of socioeconomic status and where you live. So we've for a while now captured data about somebody's own socioeconomic status and how that relates to their activity levels. Unsurprisingly, if you're better off, you're more likely to participate. If you're worse off, you're less likely to participate. That's not solely about affordability. There's lots of other things wrapped up in that, what it means to be in particular socioeconomic groups. But we've also set that against where people live. So not just your own level of deprivation or affluence, but of where you are and the people that are around you. And that has, in fact, an even bigger impact than your own socioeconomic status. So when you set those two things against each other, actually, it's not just about, am I rich or poor? If you're poor in a deprived area, you are so much less likely to be active than if you're well off in a well-off area. And that's something that we've really got to be mindful of. Again, it's not just about making stuff cheap or free for people. It's about all of those layers of kind of complex social status and who people engage with and why things feel like they're for them or not for them. But it's a really important thing that we're really reflecting on, and underpins everything that's in Uniting the Movement about why it is unashamedly about tackling inequalities. And we talk about things like proportionate universalism, disproportionately investing in the people that need it most. Andy, you're on mute.
There we go. Thank you very much, Nick. Someone had to say that at some stage, didn't they?
T-shirts made up.
Yeah. No, thanks, Nick. Particularly that last point. We're very big on universal proportionalism here at the think tank, thanks to the work that Martin Allison's been doing with us for a number of years, really pushing that. And it was that particular statistic and fact from the Active Life Survey that really struck me, I think, when you presented that, is that we've always known that your social status sort of has an impact, but it was really interesting to see how the environment around that, so hence this discussion and where Uniting the Movement takes us, Naomi, because that's exactly, I suppose, what you've been concentrating on, is with this systems approach, you can't take any one of these layers on their own. So what does it look like, to an individual in somebody with a different social status in a higher level? And I've seen that across my constituency all of the time. Is sort of the locality makes a big difference. So Naomi, in particular with localism and the place agenda being at the heart of the strategy, is that overlaid with what Nick has just sort of highlighted as the way we move forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So you will have seen in our strategy that there's a quite fundamental shift that underpins it, and it's away from what you might call more programme funding and towards more sort of partner in place funding. And not just funding, but all of the layers of support that the many, many people who care about this agenda want and need to be able to thrive in the current environment. So things that make life easier, like access to tools and photos that remove duplication, to training and access to sort of capacity building that's easy. But yeah, also to resources like funding. The main sort of shift there is thinking about all of the things that make it really easy for some people to be active, which are great, and all of the things that make it really hard for some other people to be active. And we know that that's a combination of our earliest experiences, so the relationship we form with activity in childhood, and that forms our sort of relationship, if you will, through adulthood with activity, right through to things like the way that our jobs and the organisations that we're a part of and the places and spaces that we live and work within affect our likelihood to be active. So in a nutshell, I think we're realising that there can be we've realised over time, there can be really great programmes or sort of specific moment in time projects that offer something to someone that can really work for them whilst it's there, so the 12-week programme, or, even something that's available for a couple of years to a certain community or to a certain audience. It can really have an impact whilst it's there, but as soon as it goes away, people are right back in the sort of the same environment that they were in before. That thing's gone and there's no safety net, there's nothing else left. So this sort of stopping and starting of projects and programmes, if you will, almost bubbling up, you can almost imagine them all bubbling up around the country, stopping and starting, We're trying to overcome that with a much sort of longer term, multi-layered way of thinking and partnering and funding. Now, in practical terms, if I just sort of strip out all the try not to use any jargon here, it's trying to join up some of the stuff that we already know works well. You know, so there's so many things that are effective, they just typically don't join up very well for some people and some communities. You know, they might get one of something, but not necessarily everything coming together. So we're trying to make more things join up more for more people, and for those things to be there for a significant period of time, for a sustainable period of time.
Yeah.
So great places and spaces, great facilities, great offers, all in one, you know, all in the same place for the same people.
Brilliant. Yeah, and that's quite a significant shift. And Nick, you know, obviously, you, the Chief Operating Officer, you just know how sounds a lot of money that you had to invest each year. But I think it's not a brilliant comparison, but you know, Liverpool Football Club's turnover is 300 million. You had about 300 million a year to invest in changing the behaviour of 60 million people's sort of sport and physical activity. They only had to put 11 players out on a pitch about 30 times a season. So it sort of highlights the sort of the difficulty you had. So purchasing, in a sense, exactly as you said, Naomi, some longer term changes in society, you're going to get much better than little programmes that drop in all over the country for 12 weeks and then disappear. But I suppose the impact on that is that there's been a generation of people who've been used to having those little 12-week programmes and enjoyed doing those, and feel that just doing more of the same would lead to other results. So Nick, what's the consequences of this shift in resources to sort of this systems approach, which, you know, we support, because you've got to buy a different system. And if you did two things, it would be to make young people's first experience of sport or physical activity fun, and change the physical environment to make everybody active in their daily lives. And that's a big ask, but that's where you're trying to head, isn't it?
It is, and I think one of the biggest changes is for us all collectively as a sector to be a bit more comfortable investing in capacity building. For a while now, capacity building has been the thing that you do second to make sure that there's someone there to deliver the 12-month program. Yeah. But actually what we're trying to do is flip it on its head a little bit and recognise that without the capacity there, and when we mean capacity, what we mean is brilliant people on the ground doing the hard yards to motivate people to get active and break down the barriers and provide opportunities. That's not a dirty word. In actual fact, that's the foundation that our whole ecosystem is built on. And I think we're probably looking at two particular ways that we do it. The first, and we've announced the majority of this already, is through our system partners funding process. So recognising that if you bring together, you know, we previously focused on national governing bodies as a separate cohort. We have a set of national partners who do kind of particular tactical jobs for us. And we have the network of active partnerships that are our kind of collective representation in lots of places. If you take all of those together, that's your workforce. It's not the 300 people that work in Sport England. That's your next tier out, your extended workforce, as we call it. And that's where the value comes, not through a particular program that one of them puts on, as important as that might be further down the line. So recognizing that kind of organizational capacity is really necessary, and investing in the right sorts of, you know, leadership development and training to help support them. But then through things like our place-based funding is to recognise that there's then another tier of kind of deliverers out there that get on and make all of this happen. And if you can do it in an environment that all parts of that local system is geared up towards a similar objective, then you're going to get so much more. So I give you the example from a couple of days ago. So I went to Active Kent and Medway, used to be Kent Sport, to see the team there. It's my local active partnership. And just hearing from them the stuff that they're trying to do on the ground, you know, they're hosted in their local council, in Kent County Council. They're sat across from the adult social care team and the kind of those dealing with kind of, you know, children in care and things like that. That then fosters a whole series of relationships that wouldn't otherwise happen. And then they've got the network to get out there and deliver through things like the school games organisers network, who do an awful lot of the delivery on the ground. And so you've done all of that before you've ever come up with a programme. So I think for us, it's about flipping the kind of process and focus of investment around a little bit, where we invest first in the people and the capacity and the skills and the leadership in order to do all of those things effectively. And from that will then come a whole load of brilliant stuff. But if you jump straight to the stuff, you miss something really quite profound.
Yeah, that's really important. And we did an earlier piece of work at the think tank with Durham around the politics of localism and what that means. And one of the things we discovered from that, Naomi, was that particularly the sort of people that Nick is talking about. So at that tier, it's fine. But then when you get into community, quite often it takes people 3, 4, 5 years to generate that level of trust. So trusted organisations or trusted people. And quite often they don't have the social capital to be in those networks. They're busy, probably running a boxing club in the part-time or running some sports development programme sort of just in the community without having any networks at all. So I suppose there's two bits from that, is that how do you build that capacity at that sort of level, sort of one beyond, as Nick has said, and are we willing to take risks, that learning from failure? I know through the local delivery pilots what they were all about, but are we able to build that into sort of continually moving forward, that we'll take some risks with working with these sort of groups that wouldn't do the traditional form filling and all the rest of it, but actually can have a massive impact on the communities that we're talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I think one of the most important lessons from the delivery of our previous strategy, which included the pilots that we call the local delivery pilots, which, if I explain, was
Sorry,
and
what jargon
it was
we throw in, so yeah, feel free to.
It's fine, just so I can explain for anyone who doesn't know. We have been working, and still are, with 12 places to try to do exactly what we just talked about, which is to make some of the influences that help people to be more active come together in a place. So think of it as a load of sort of arrows of policy and funding and programmes, try and get more of those arrows pointing in the same direction for the people who need the most help, which in practical terms means some policy areas working together, officers working together, working with community groups to make things make sense and make things easier for communities. Now, that sounds easy to say. The ripple effect is significant, as you've said. The main thing that we learned is that there needs to be more what you might call connecting capacity. So exactly as you said, all over this country, there are hundreds of thousands of passionate individuals running creating incredible opportunities for people in their communities. They know those communities best. They know people, they know what to do, they know how to do it, but they're not necessarily connected in with other people who also have the same passions and efforts, who might be able to help. Things like sharing spaces, sharing, workforce, sharing resources, but also connected in with what you might call the more statutory part of the system. So where the funding comes from, where big choices are being made that can help them or hinder them. And what we really found, and it sounds quite straightforward when you say it, but it is very important, is that a lot of the capacity to make those connections has gone from the system locally. So those are the people who spot where there are opportunities to connect people, who know that if you change that policy, it will ruin that opportunity. So the people who are in between and drawing these threads together and establishing common purpose and helping people see how that we can be more than the sum of our parts. And in reality, that means that all those things get more and more disconnected. So really, I think the biggest lesson for us was that connecting capacity matters. And actually, we've carried that through to ourselves. So we're thinking, the capacity to make sense across government, to look across government departments and say, well, there's that bit of policy and there's that fund coming from that department and there's us over here doing this, that we're a player in something much bigger and we need more of a connecting role. So the emphasis of the capacity to make good connections and in real terms, if you will, get sport and physical activity a seat around the table and make this high on the agenda and help people to connect people moving more with the stuff that really matters in communities and in the nation, the stuff we all care about, like healthy, happy children and healthy, happy lives, and healthy places. That moving and sport and activity is absolutely integral to those agendas. So that extra capacity really matters. And so when we talk about expanding our work with more places, we're talking about exactly that sort of thing. Being willing to invest in the people and the capacity and the skills to make these connections, to forge those opportunities, to spot where we could do things, be more than the sum of our parts, make better use of different sources of funding, as well as being able to back that with some resource ourselves and say, look, where there needs to be some investment, we can offer some. So it's that sort of, some people say the difference is working on the system rather than necessarily in the system. So looking at how everything is adding up or not and being willing to invest in that.
Yeah. No, I think you're right to highlight that. I remember starting my working life in a recreation and arts department with Martin Allison, strangely enough, who was my boss. Although I didn't know him, he was way up the food chain in those days. I didn't know who he was, but I sat next to a community development team whose job was entirely to be capacity building in all the communities across the city of Leicester. That's long gone, as a lot of other sort of things in the world. And I suppose, Nick, this comes back to, I suppose, that having gone through the pandemic and tackling these inequalities, and Naomi's just touched on it a bit. But that cross-departmental thing, particularly the work that you did at DCMS to really bring in other departments to ensure they were part of the solution. So I spend as much of my time now, I'm chair of my local LEP. If I want to tackle health and economic inequalities, I can do that in a different system, but I want it to be joined up. So levelling up agendas, shared prosperity funds, all those other things, even getting a very small percentage of those is far larger than the Sport England funding available, isn't it? So if we could just scrape 5% of every town deal budget or 5% of levelling up agenda money, then we could do both, which is put some money into the sector, but also build that capacity to do it in a slightly different way that doesn't always talk about sport and physical activity. So, Nick, going back through those active life sort of work, clearly money is a bit of a barrier, it's not the only one, but is there other things that cross-departmentally in other sectors we could sort of bring across to really make a bit of a difference? There's tons, Andy, and one of the big things that we've worked hard on over the last few years is to be able to better articulate the positive outcomes of being active rather than to advocate for sport in and of itself. And I think that's transformed some of the relationships that we've got with, whether it's at a national level, the Department for Transport or the Department for Health, or locally with a LEP or with a commissioning group or a healthcare provider. Or those conversations are happening in a more kind of nuanced and focused way than certainly I can remember them happening. And that's partly because we've got better at advocating for the overall benefits of what we can provide rather than asking people for money for our stuff, if that makes sense. So we've definitely made some progress there. I think continuing to focus particularly at the kind of local, regional level is really important. Having spent 15 years working in a civil service department, you spend your entire life being told by everyone that you need to do more of their thing and it'll solve your problem. At the same time as you've got decision makers and lawmakers and politicians and other senior civil servants telling you a whole bunch of other things that are really, really important, and some stuff that's just on fire that you need to deal with immediately. So I think we sometimes have overly optimistic expectations that someone somewhere in a government department is going to write a transformative strategy about sport, rather than us gearing up and saying, well, do you know what? I can see you're trying to achieve this big thing with a town deal or a big thing with a recovery fund. We can play a bit of a part. We've got some stuff, it's good. And when we do our good stuff, you get some of the things that you want. And that works both kind of locally, regionally and nationally. But it's a bit more of a fight's the wrong word, but you gain ground by the inch, not by the mile.
we've all spent years and years waiting for kind of genuinely transformative cross-government strategies. And yes, there's a version of the future where somebody says, I'm going to invest £10 billion in a totally radically transformed sport and physical activity infrastructure. I think that's quite unlikely. So I think we've got to get the ground game right, and we've got to, fight for our voice round the table, or a bit more influence here, or a good relationship there. Coming back to your previous point about capacity building, you can only do that with a movement of people that are all advocating for the same thing, which is why that's what we're trying to do in our strategy.
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, if having been involved, I suppose, in the sector for 20 years, I feel that sometimes I think I look back at things I've said and overclaimed for the sector, or demanded X, Y, and Z for the sector, whereas actually a little bit more humility about the role that we play in a bigger space. And so I found that even on my LEP board, take 4 or 5 years, but when other people repeat back some of the messages around a healthy workforce, it's finally landed for a different reason. And it's not that I want people to invest in a particular sport or others, but actually they recognise that their workplace is a place to increase sort of a healthy workforce. And so there is exactly that, Nick, because I don't think, I can't see in the foreseeable future anybody writing us a large cheque to do what we currently do. And I don't know, Naomi, part of the reason for the change in the emphasis of the strategy was that, I get it all the time, had it for the last decade or 20 years, is that people come to you with a good idea and said, if you just did this everywhere, we would solve our problems. And we've done a lot of that. We've done some good programmes and repeated them, where those inequalities still remain. So clearly doing more of the same is not going to do that. So how radically different will this strategy allow us to be? And will there be other people who have been probably used to funding, who eventually won't be funded in the same way in the future? I mean, it's a difficult one because it's a sort of prediction. But clearly, if we're going to genuinely tackle these inequalities, something's got to be done differently. That includes some of the resources and the capacity building that goes with it. I don't know if that's too difficult to want to give it too much attention, but that seems to be the natural consequence of this shift in direction.
I actually think, and I hope you won't view this as a cop-out, it's my genuine answer. I think the thing that is becoming radically different, that needs to be radically different, is Sport England. So I don't think we are looking out and saying there's a partner there that doesn't matter to us now, or there's a place that doesn't matter anymore. That isn't true, and it's not what we're thinking or planning. What we are doing is saying, it's been probably too hard for the smallest grassroots organisations, who are the most connected to the people we're trying to reach, to work with us and access our support. So how do we need to change to do that? And you'll see in our implementation plan there's a commitment to revolutionising our approach to open funding, which should make it a lot easier to understand how to work with us and what resources to access, no matter how big or small you are as part of this movement. And by small, I mean size of organisation. So, we need to change ourselves. You will see that one of our major commitments has been to be the change. So it's this sort of turning the mirror around and thinking, who needs the most help here? Who needs the most support? Can everybody access that equally? And so how do we need to change? And one of the ways we're changing is exactly what we've just talked about, thinking more about how to organise ourselves around more place-based partnerships and relationships. And also working with partners differently. So, it's really important that we hold ourselves and our partners to account for public money. It's not useful to create a competitive environment where partners feel that they are trying to beat other partners, in terms of numbers and results, because that really erodes a collaborative environment, the exact environment that people, citizens, humans need to be able to be active. So we really have to, if there's going to be radical change, I really think we are thinking about the radical change in Sport England to be a better player in this space. We've done some great things. We've been on an important journey, but we know that we can do a lot more and we can be a lot more. And so I really hope you don't think that's a cop-out. But, the example that Nick just gave is a good one. We know that we need to do more to show how sport and activity is the vehicle for change. We can't make everyone care about sport and activity at the top of their agenda. You know, a CEO of a big place said to me a couple of years ago, it's always stuck with me, the thing that keeps me awake at night is the growing cost of the prescription bills in my place. It's the fact that we have parts of my place that the communities that are in conflict. You know, it's that we have this enormous difference in life expectancy and a matter of stops on a train line. It isn't how many people are playing sport. He said, but if you tell me how sport and activity can be part of those things that are keeping me awake, I'm all ears. And so, you know, that reframe, again, is something that we are getting, I'd say, better at. You know, depending on what table you're around, depending on what situation you're in, is what to lead with. You know, and how to be most influential so that sport and activity does have a future. So, you know, of funding and support and appears in policies and strategies nationally and locally. You know, that's what we're all about. But it's got to play a role in the bigger agenda.
Yeah. Don't worry, no, that wasn't a cop-out, because actually I think the culture of Sport England and the changing relationship with the sector is quite fundamental and important, isn't it? I think we've all been around long enough from the days there was a sort of berated fingers being waved at bodies who didn't deliver. Hopefully that's sort of long gone, and it's now a partnership in which that is delivered. And I suppose, Nick, this sort of builds on just exactly what Naomi's just been saying, is that, you know, you can be part of a solution. So, you know, in a sense, if we're going to tackle those health inequalities, it's pointless us saying that we've got the total answer. You know, if somebody's still pretty poor in poor housing in a local area, and as a former politician, I sort of get that. My priority, even though I was passionate about sport, I'd certainly put the future of the accident and emergency unit or the housing stock or social welfare and other things before I probably would then get to talk about sport. And physical activity plays a part in it, but it isn't the total answer to all of those. And sometimes some of our colleagues get a little bit carried away with just how we're going to answer all of these societal problems. We're part of it, but not all of them. And I suppose that comes then back, Nick, to the bit about proportionate universalism. I think we struggled, if we're being honest, in describing what that actually looks like. So I think people get the concept, but then by the end of the paper, all the discussion, people are, yeah, so what does that actually going to mean in reality? I don't know whether you've got any further with answers of what proportionate universalism looks like for Sport England when it's delivered.
So it will have different manifestations through the different activity that we can do. So there isn't a kind of a perfect description, but for me it feels like a continuation of a journey where historically we as Sport England and the sector has provided a disproportionate amount of support for people who are already really good at sport and really, really like sport, right? So the sort of the sort of people that would do sport if we made it illegal tomorrow, because they're that passionate about it. So giving that person a facility that's 3% better, or 2% more time to train on their thing that they're doing already, was a reasonable thing to do when you're just set up to focus solely on sport, solely through kind of core sporting organisations. But our mission has changed completely. We still hold that with us, and we invest a lot of money and a lot of time and energy into doing that. But there's other stuff as well. So the flip side of it, where we're getting to on the journey, is that rather than disproportionately investing in those people that we've already persuaded, is to disproportionately invest in the people that we haven't yet and that need it most, frankly, and that can benefit the most. Because Andy, getting you to play an extra 15 minutes of rugby a week, I'm sure would be great for you, but probably isn't the best use of taxpayer money. Getting somebody with multiple long-term health conditions who has struggled for a long time to do anything, getting them to be a tiny bit active can start them on a journey that can be genuinely transformative. Yeah. And in terms of thinking about where we put our time and energy, we're moving more to that end of the spectrum. We're not leaving anything behind. We're not disinvesting from large swathes of organisations, as Naomi said. In fact, we've just secured 5 years of funding for lots of those organisations. What we're talking about is redressing the balance a little bit and making sure that those that haven't had the support that they've needed in the past get more of it now. And that, like I say, that will manifest itself differently, whether you're funding organisations or building capacity, the type of capacity that you build, or even just running an open investment program. We're a lottery distributor. We'll always have an open fund for people to bid for, but we will unashamedly target that towards tackling inequalities in sports participation. And I think that's a good place to be.
I fundamentally agree. I think it's me. I've often said, if you
Yeah.
cut me in the middle, I'd be sport all the way through. I would still do it if you made it illegal. And I don't need any of my sport or physical activity subsidising. I am fine. I would much prefer that the finances that are available are targeted towards individuals or communities that will benefit, but more importantly, from a taxpayer's point of view, that make a substantial difference to exactly the sort of thing you've been talking about, Naomi, though impacting on those other agendas and tackling health inequalities. I don't know whether either of you saw the Times report on some of those communities recently, where children are arriving at primary school in conditions that they're just not able to function in many sort of aspects of their life, including some basic social skills. So I suppose the question is, how far and deep can we go with this strategy to being part of the solution to that? I mean, I heard that 20 years ago, primary school teachers telling me that the children arriving at their schools are already about a year behind in certain social classes, and therefore that feeds through, particularly in physical activity, to sort of that physical literacy space. So I know it's not entirely your space, but that sort of school and preschool, where that first experience of sport and physical activity just needs to be a positive one. And how far can we stretch that, and how can we influence other bits, which goes back to Nick's point about that joined up sort of aspect, because it just does feel that particularly school sport and that early years is something still a little bit off the pace, I put it politely.
Yeah, so I think this goes back to where Sport England and our network of partners, the movement, if you will, but if we talk about Sport England now, has a really important advocating role. It's really easy to keep talking about funding, but actually a lot of our advocating is to modify things rather than necessarily around the funding. It's the way that funding is used. So when, for example, plans are put in place, that we are around the table saying, hey, we know this really important thing about the first few years of a child's experience, and that needs to be built into this. And it's not necessarily about amounts of funding. It's as this opportunity arises, we need to inject this crucial bit of information. We need to, give that eye-opening bit of data and evidence. And I will come back to the children and young people question, I promise, but there's some really striking examples of that. So there's a lot of money going into park spaces at the moment, and green spaces all being planned, as you know. And actually one of our place partners recently did, if you will, an audit or an assessment of their park spaces and the usage of the parks. And there was one particular park that was almost smack bang in the middle of one of the most affluent parts of that place, and one of the least affluent parts of that place. So if anything, if you will, it was a joint asset, a joint resource. But what they found from this bit of work was that the park was used almost exclusively by the more affluent half of the bordering community, and the less affluent half really didn't use the park much at all. Now, when we spoke with the communities to understand that, there was lots of different reasons. One was basic things, like families not having the equipment to play in the park. So the assumption that families have equipment, literally just the basics, to play in the park. It was things like confidence and knowledge about what to do with kids in the park when you take them there. You don't necessarily know what to do. But there was also some really, really surprising stuff, like that the gateways, so literally the gates into the park, that was smack bang in the middle of these communities, were all situated on the affluent side of it. So there's a signal all the time about who that asset is for, who that community space is really for. I have to walk around to the affluent park to get in. There are literal fences on my side of the community to this park. And so these things are there all the time. And it's really important that we're pointing this out. That's not unusual. It's actually very common. I heard that story. I was in disbelief. I came home. I looked at my park. It's exactly the same. So this is just an example I'm giving of where sometimes it's like modifying what happens with crucial evidence and insight, things where we have to be around the table and say it's essential that things like this change. And so this is our sort of mission now, is to be around more of those tables with more of that crucial insight.
Yeah. And I suppose that's where the concept of co-creation is really important, is that, you know, with all due respect to a lot of us, I sit around a lot of those tables where it's the same middle class sort of individuals deciding on the futures of local communities, quite often not really engaged, or, you know, that lack of proximity to the groups that we're supposed to be serving and working for. And we'll try our hardest to do all of those, but it's easy to miss some really obvious stuff until you listen to the people. And work with them to create their own solutions to these things when they see it from their perspective. So that's a great example, Naomi, I sort of think. Nick, I suppose just to start to draw this to a close, I suppose we've seen all of this. We've got this evidence that the strategy is moving in a particular direction. You know, what's your ambitions? You know, what will success look like for you, and over what sort of time scale? Because I mean, my belief is that we've probably designed physical activity out of our lives over a 40-year period, so it's not going to be a quick win, this, is it? But will we see some sort of benchmarks when other departments or other organisations, the little light bulb moment starts to happen and they're starting to deliver the things that we want to? Is that the sort of ambition, or unlocking resources, or just seeing a shift in those figures on inequality?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, Nick.
So look, there's a reason that our strategy is a 10-year strategy and not a kind of 4-year cycle strategy as we've often had in the past. There's a great quote that's in there, and actually I think it was Naomi that first introduced me to this. People always overestimate what they can achieve in a year, but massively underestimate what they can achieve in 10. Which I've repeated to loads of people since, and is kind of my go-to, in that it's quite hard if you're embarking on a journey like this to say with a really high degree of confidence that numbers would have done this next year and that the year after and that the year after. Not least because actually just before the pandemic, sports participation figures were at the highest point they had ever been, at least the highest point that we've ever measured them, which we were exceptionally proud of. And so we had all sorts of interesting ideas about how we can continue that upwards trajectory. And then a global pandemic hit. And so, you know, you're at the mercy of an awful lot of external factors. What we've tried to develop is something that gives us a better sense about what the different kinds of milestones along the journey are going to be. So if you take the overall theory that underpins the strategy, what are the things that are going to tell us that we're making those right steps at the right time in the right way? So we've set out in the strategy a kind of series of ambitions over 3 years, a series of kind of indicators of progress that if they're happening, they're going to start to tell us that the right things are happening, that we know from other things that we've done in the past are the precursors to bigger and broader change. And you've got to reflect and learn as you go, and kind of make sure that the practical things that you're doing are going in the right places at the right time, in the right way, in the right amounts. But the theory is that all then aggregates up to broader population level change. And we've been really clear internally through our strategy development with DCMS when we talk to them that we're not moving away from an overall desire to kind of answer the fundamental question you've got. Success for us is more people active, fewer people inactive, and the gap between the inequalities closing. Right? There are 3 overall measures of success. But what we're not doing is saying that by the end of this year, number 1 will be up by 7, number 2 will be up by 3, and number 3 will have closed by 1, because we just don't know. There's too many moving parts to the system. The commitment is that's where we've got to get to, and if we don't, we won't have succeeded. But there's an awful lot of other stuff that we've got to monitor in the way, along the way, and some of those will be indicators like, you know, a new government strategy that embraces certain things and focuses what they do in the same kind of complementary way as ours, or investment from the Department for Transport in 15-minute neighbourhoods, or whatever it happens to be. And there's hundreds of them. Learning along the way that's going to tell us that intervention worked, that intervention didn't, this intervention needs to be done differently. It might work there, it probably won't work there. But all of that then aggregating up, which is a much more complex position than we've been in. You know, you've been involved from the days of, an NGB focused strategy where we dish out, we want you, Sport X, to deliver this many additional people, and we'll hit you with a stick or take your money away if you don't do it, to right, guys, there's 130 system partners now. You're all with us on this journey. We've all got to work together. We've all got to understand the conditions for success. We've all got to share the learning along the way. And we've all got to share the ambition to increase activity, decrease inactivity, and tackle inequalities. So it's much more nuanced environment, but it's the only way that you'll deliver the sort of thing that we're setting out in the strategy.
No, that's a brilliant summary, Nick. And it just demonstrates just how hard it is to prove what we do back to the sort of paymasters in one sense, isn't it? Whereas from a UK sport perspective, delivering a number of medals and having sort of really easy targets is a much simpler place to be. And I suppose, Naomi, that leads on to, obviously being central to the delivery of the strategy. Exactly what Nick has just sort of said is that there's so many other moving parts to this, like an energy crisis, which impacts the number of swimming pools, or continued pressure on local government, still the biggest spender on leisure services in our local communities. You know, we estimate the think tank that probably £600 million has been taken out of that, double your annual budget. So Nick's entirely right, isn't it? You're just relying on so many other moving parts and factors. It's difficult to pin a reduction in physical activity on any particular part of that, but it will happen in the same ways there'll be some successes. So I suppose you've been central to it. So if you've got Nick said it was difficult, and then came out with a really pithy, very well thought through answer. Have you got anything similar that sort of demonstrates how you'll be ticking off those milestones as we go through over the next decade? Million individuals and their life stories, and hence where we really started right at the beginning about the complexity of that segmentation is that I look down even my street and the number of different families in different situations. You need 40 solutions for the 40 houses that are on our street because everyone's completely different and from a different sort of background. So I think it's important not to do that. Nick, we're just going to sort of draw to a close. I mean, is there anything in particular, just to finish with, that any sort of key messages that you'd like to get across at this stage, that, the learnings and the process that we're going through? This is that BBC bit. Is there anything a grateful nation would like to hear from you, Minister?
Hopefully none of you ever get subjected to a minister like me. Would be in big trouble. I think the place I'd finish is kind of where we started with the movement element of all of this, and recognising the journey that we've been on as Sport England over a long time now, from thinking of ourselves as 300 odd people and 300 odd million quid that pulls the strings of the sports sector and kind of gets to decide what happens and tells people, and then people write funding bids off the back of it, and we then give people money and then take it away again if they don't do stuff, to being one small part of a system of people that are doing important stuff that, if we all do it together, will aggregate up to something brilliant. And that sometimes means that where people would have come to us in the past and sort of said, when are you going to design this fund that I might be able to get, or when are you going to tell us what we should be doing on children and young people, or we're kind of not going to do that. We're going to be there to support people. We're going to make our own interventions. We're going to build our own investment programs with the money that we've got, but we're not going to try and play that role of a kind of top-down command and control. If we can plan this whole system and move all the pieces, we'll all be fine. It just doesn't work. Yeah. So, and Tim said this, for those of you that heard him speak at the Elevate conference a week or so ago, he said the same, is that kind of don't feel like you need to wait for us. I've heard really positive commitment to the mission that we set out in our strategy, that it chimes with lots of other people's. You don't need to wait for us. If you need help from us, we're here to give you that help. financial and otherwise. And increasingly, it's about, collaboration and sharing insight and finding spaces to co-create and just bringing people together rather than us paying for stuff. But don't feel like you need to wait. Like, I think we're all pretty clear on what the mission is and the necessary changes. It's happening in places and spaces across the country more quickly and in a more profound way than it's happening even in Sport England. And I think we're doing quite a good job. If you look at what Hayley Lever and co are doing up in Greater Manchester, I could name dozens of places. Like, the change is kind of happening out there. Let's go with that momentum rather than thinking that it's all gonna come from Sport England towers.
Yeah, no, that's a great point to make. Is that I do feel that lots of people don't know about Sport England, but there are people in a system that do wait for you to give them the signal to go, and we can't work at that pace, can we? So I suppose, Naomi, similar sort of piece. Is there anything we've not covered? Key messages for people out there around the policy sort of space. Is there anything you just want to get across that we've not quite covered? But particularly picking up on Nick's point, it's great to sort of wait, but are you able to share the learnings? I mean, one of my frustrations has been, that's probably why we partly exist, is when something really good is happening, trying to share the lessons and the learning from it, both the failures and the successes, as quickly as possible. So we're not just repeating, someone at the other end of the country picks up something and tries something we know failed somewhere else. So I suppose it's just, from my point of view, is there a role still for Sport England just to ensure that? And I think Nick hinted it is, but that part of the role is really just sort of sharing best practice and also what doesn't work. It's any consolation, Naomi, we've been trying that for a decade here, just to try and stop people reinventing the wheel, although sometimes it's necessary to reinvent it and give it another go. But yeah, we're more than happy to work with you on sort of how that looks, because it's, we often get people coming with the same issues or want to do exactly the same thing. And part of our role is being that super connect to say, oh, hang on a minute, somebody over here is already doing that, or you may want to speak to so-and-so in that app, they're already 2 years ahead of you, or whatever. So yeah, it's really important. We don't produce lots and lots of material, but just connect the right people, and hopefully we're part of that system that you and Nick have sort of talked about. So it's really, really helpful. Look, I just wanted to thank both of you for your time today. I've taken up a lot of time, but hopefully that's unpacked a lot of the sort of the live, where we're at, the Active Live survey, the way that the strategy's sort of unpacking itself. I know lots of people are living and breathing it. Hopefully we can return to this probably about another six months or so, or definitely six to 9 months. We just see where further those systems partners and how some of this is landing, and what are the challenges. It's not going to be the end of the cost of living crisis, so perhaps we'll look at whether the sector is being challenged externally as well, and how we're responding to it. But once again, thanks both for all your hard work in getting us through the pandemic. For a start, I think, a big tick to Sport England. I get that feedback a lot on how you handled the pandemic and the flexibility that you showed through that. So if that can be maintained going forward, I think that'll be a really good for the sector as a whole. Once again, thanks very much for your time today. Hopefully people have got something from it. I'll put some details in the chat box and some other pieces later when we've done this, so people can sort of pick up on any issues. And we'll take some Q&As off the back of the podcast and others, and I'll come back to you with those. But once again, thanks ever so much. Really, really enjoyed my time with you again this morning.
Thanks very much, Andy.